Someone asked me currently the biggest relationship between China and the US is economic and trade. Politically, the relationship has grown quite cold. And culturally, China has reduced imports of American films and is expected to further restrict travel and student exchanges. If a complete decoupling were to happen, who would suffer greater political and economic losses? Politically, it's difficult to say clearly. Trump has long since damaged America's political credibility. China also isn't winning many allies. Just a few days ago, China's proposal to jointly oppose the US was rejected by Australia. Economically, however, it's clear that China would suffer greater losses. China would face the issue of surplus goods, unable to be sold, severely disrupting its economy. Currently, exports to the US account for 15% of China's total exports. To absorb these exports, China would have to significantly increase exports to other economies. China's exports to the US alone equal the combined exports to Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, India, and Mexico. China would either need to double its exports to these countries or turn to domestic consumption, which would be challenging. Moreover, China's exports are primarily divided among three major markets: ASEAN, the EU, and the US. If the US market is lost, shifting exports to ASEAN or the EU would flood these markets, driving down local prices and prompting these countries to impose additional tariffs on Chinese products. If neither ASEAN nor the EU can absorb the surplus, the only option left is domestic sales. In terms of imports, the US accounts for 7% of China's total imports, roughly equivalent to South Korea, Japan. Australia and Russia, this figure has already been adjusted over the past 8 years, with significant increases from Russia and reductions from the US and Taiwan. This 7% is comprised equally of three main categories: oil, soybeans, and other grains, and chips, precision instruments. In recent years, China has increased grain imports and neglected domestic production, partly to reduce the trade surplus with the US. Decoupling would lead to grain shortages, but soybeans could be sourced from Brazil and Argentina, oil from Russia, and chips from South Korea and Japan. However, technological transfers from us outsourced manufacturing would halt. Thankfully for China, Trump's confrontational approach globally provided some moral support and created openings. If under Biden, global chip sales to China were banned, China would face dire consequences. Thus, if exports to China dropped to zero, Brazil's share would increase by 2% in soybeans, reaching 7.2%. Russia's share in oil would increase by 2%, reaching 7.5%, and South Korea's share in chips would increase by 3%, reaching 9.9%, leaving the US at zero. The top 5 import sources for China would then be South Korea 9.9%, Russia 7.5%, Brazil 7.2%, Japan 6.8%, and Australia 6.6%. With Li Jae-myung likely taking office soon in South Korea, China's strengthened relationships with South Korea, Russia, and Brazil make this situation reasonable. The primary loss for the US would be consumer goods supply. While theoretically replaceable by imports from countries like India and Mexico, these alternatives would suffer from lower quality and incomplete supply chains. Moreover, China has a more strategic leadership capable of quickly adjusting, redirecting exports to other markets. Domestic consumption, developing desert agriculture, reducing meat consumption to increase efficiency, and restricting grain exports. In contrast, the US adaptation ability seems weaker. Prices would soar significantly, leading to social unrest. Stores would experience shortages initially, followed by filling shelves with lower quality goods. Excess grain would rot due to high processing costs. Losing the Chinese market would severely impact the US export economy, creating more declining cities like Detroit and potentially triggering another banking crisis. In summary, in the short term, around 1 year, China would suffer greater losses, while in the long term, the US would face more significant impacts. However, the US has self-repair capabilities. After 2 years of hardship, midterm elections would likely shift control to the Democrats.